So the webinar is now being recorded, and the slides will be available with the recording on the IIM website after this webinar, so you can review that at your leisure. The other thing is that questions, please, as we go for the panelists in the Q&A bar, which you'll find either at the top, if you're like me, or at the bottom of your Zoom app, if you're on a phone or on a desktop. So without further ado, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our 4 guests today. First up, we've got Jo Minns, and Jo will introduce herself in a minute, but you can read her bio there. We're also joined by Jess Mullinger. Mullinger, Jess, or Mullinger? How am I saying that?
Mullinger.
Mullinger, so a hard G. And Jess is a director of interim with Solace. Is that correct, Jess? Have I got that right?
It is indeed, yes.
And you've been working as an interim service provider now for some 15 years.
Probably more than that now, actually, to be honest.
More than that now, yeah.
I won't reveal how many more.
We have Simon Hudson, Director of Morphosis Partners. Simon specialises in supporting interims through various stages of their career, whether you're embarking on that, whether you're in the middle of your career and having a midlife crisis, or you're coming up to the autumn of your career and you're thinking of moving into something else, and how you basically keep relevant and current and tuned in to the market as you go through that. So Simon will talk a wee bit about that, and we'll also answer some questions as well. And then we've got Tony, who's the chair of the IIM, that's the Institute of Interim Management, has been working C-suite for some 25 years or so, and Tony will give you the commercial break as to why it's a good idea if you are embarking on a career as an interim to join the Institute. My name is Bruce Rayner. I'll be your host for today. Myself, I've been an interim professional working on my own account for more years than anybody can remember. So without further ado, Jo, why don't you introduce yourself and jump into the research?
Thanks, Bruce. That's great. And hi, everyone. Thanks for dialing in today. So just a bit of background of what I'm going to talk about. A few years ago, for what seemed like a fantastic idea at the time, I decided to embark on a master's and in occupational psychology. And as part of that, I had to do a dissertation. And I was really keen to understand people's motivation for pursuing an interim career. It's something that I've done myself since 2010. I've just realised, actually, Bruce, the previous slide's also out of date for the number of years I've been in this field.
Oh, right.
So I was just really keen to understand why people do that. I knew why I'd been motivated to do it, but I wondered if there were anything sort of specific out there that caused people to want an interim career. And it also struck me that an awful lot of people do this, but I couldn't really find anything about what success looked like for interim managers. So I did some research looking at what are the behaviours and characteristics of successful interims, and off the back of that, sort of made some recommendations for people considering interim careers. So I'll rattle through the summary of my research today. Feel free to put any questions in the chat, and Bruce will facilitate us answering those between us. And as I go through, rather than just talk at you, I'll also be bringing Jess into the conversation, because obviously what I did was quite an academic study, albeit speaking to quite a few current interims. I did an awful lot of reading, but Jess will very much be able to give you the sort of reality from what she sees from her clients and candidates as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of when is the right time to move into interim management, I think the most important thing from the research that I did is about being happy with the level you've reached in your career. People don't take on interims as a development opportunity. Now, that's not to say you don't develop as an interim. You absolutely do. You'll work in different organisations with different people, even if it's the same subject matter from one company to the next. Just the fact you're in a different environment will help you to continue to develop. But really, people are hiring you on the basis of what you know and what you've done before. So it's very much about your employability as an interim. And I think the other aspect of that is it does impact financially. So if you go into an interim very early in your career and you're being brought in on the sort of basis of what you've done before, that's not going to then elevate you into that next sort of position. I think there's also something around objective and subjective career success. So objective career success is around things like your earnings and your status, so those visible signs to other people. Subjective is much more about that sense of personal accomplishment and satisfaction. And what I found from all of the interims I spoke to is they didn't really mind what other people thought of them. They weren't sort of bound by traditional career paths or anything like that. It was much more around the work they were doing and getting their own sense of satisfaction. And one thing that was really interesting from my research is it didn't seem to matter whether people had kind of felt pulled towards an interim career, as I have myself, or whether people had almost been pushed into it, for example, because of redundancy or a permanent role came to an end and they just took on an interim role because that was what was out there. Successful interims are both people who've actively chosen it and people who've fallen into it. And I suspect on the call there's a mix of both. So Jess, I don't know how those sort of three key points align to what you see with the candidates that you work with.
Yeah, very much so, actually. I think the one thing that we are noticing a change in really is the first point, which is we, you know, for years and years and years, we've always said you must have reached the pinnacle of what you want your career to be before you move into interim, and you tend to then move from that role into a similar role somewhere else, and so on. We have started to see a bit of a change in that, actually. So we are starting to see people now move into an assistant director role and then progress into a director, a corporate director, and even a chief exec. That's been a very, very recent thing, I would say, in the last year, actually. But we've seen 2 or 3 of our interims who joined us, you know, 10 years ago as an assistant director, and have been moved into and are now operating as chief execs, and they've made that development within their interim career, which previously was pretty much unheard of, really. But I think the key is that they are tending to move within the organisation. So they're tending to go in, do a brilliant job, be promoted within that organisation, and then move into the next level of role in another organisation as an interim somewhere else. Rather than, you know, be seen as an assistant director and then just be taken on a different level in a different organisation as an interim. So I think that's probably the distinction, really.
Yeah. And it is interesting that that's starting to change, because my research is actually 3 years old now, and I think the market has moved on a bit since then. So yeah, thanks, Jess. So in terms of what to expect from interim roles, these were the themes that came up consistently across the interviews I did with existing interims around sort of why people want to do interim. So the variety and challenge, it will probably be work you've done before, but because it's a new environment and different people, you do still get that sense of variety from it. Flexibility is a big one, and it's interesting because there's a caveat that sits behind that. There is a certain thing around, actually, you do have flexibility, but also assignments only come up at a certain time. And I think, well, certainly speaking for myself, I went into interim thinking, oh, it's great, I'll work for 9 months of the year and take 3 months off every summer. Unfortunately, my clients don't quite see it the same way. So you do get flexibility, but not quite in the way that you would expect. And the other one I'd sort of pull out there is around the independence. It's very much a sort of transactional exchange, not loyalty. So that's not to say that you're not putting your client's interests first. You absolutely are. But you're not working in the same way as when you're an employee. You're not thinking about your performance rating and is that going to impact your bonus. You are there to do a specific task. And actually that can make you better at what you do, because you're focusing solely on what's the right answer for the organisation rather than worrying about what that means for you as an individual. And that then ties into the politics and the stress as well. So I think stress definitely came out as a theme, but again, that came with a caveat. There is a bit of stress. There can be a bit of stress around finding assignments, and I'll touch on that again a little bit later on. One thing that it was interesting that didn't come up in terms of the themes of why people went into interim roles, nobody I spoke to did it for the money. And I think maybe when I set out as an interim, it was, from a tax perspective, certainly it was a bit more favourable, but that isn't what's driving, or certainly the people I spoke to, it wasn't what was driving them to do it. Is there anything that you'd add there, Jess?
Yeah, I mean, on the money point, I think certainly since the IR35, the changes in those regulations, it is much more of a level playing field now. So I think at one point it was seen as a bit of a gravy train, and that's no longer the case. So I think I can definitely recognise money being taken out of the equation. I recognise all of those factors, and we talk to our associates regularly about all of those things. I think you've got to be very, very disciplined to achieve those things. So we run regular virtual coffee mornings for our associates, and all sorts of themes come up on those. And the last one, just before I went away a couple of weeks ago, was around this issue of how do you actually have the discipline to achieve the work-life balance, which is one of the reasons you went into this. And many of our associates are busier than they were in a full-time role as an associate, because they've got maybe an interim role that they're doing 3 or 4 days a week. They've got 2 coaching clients. They've got an investigation running. So it does take a lot of discipline, I think, to achieve the things that you want to achieve. And I think it takes time as well. So I think you get into this work and you build yourself up, and you learn about how you can work the best you can in this way of working, and you build a reputation as well. And I think only at that point are you able to then benefit from some of these things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if I think back to my first year as an interim myself, I actually only took 11 days off that year.
Yeah.
And as an employee, I used to get 30 days leave, and I would flex up to 35 days, and I would take every single hour of that. Then suddenly when I was working for myself, I stopped, which looking back was a bit silly, but it was definitely part of that transition.
People do get pulled into that feeling of either not being able to say no, or thinking they want to, they don't know what's around the corner. So it's a case of, oh, you've got to say yes. And actually, once you settle into it, you do start to realise that sometimes it's better to say no.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of the skills and behaviours, I think it's worth saying that as an interim, you definitely need to have a specific selling point. Now, that will be based on the experience you have. It might be a specific sector that you've worked in. And the reason you need to, or the reason it's helpful to have something specific, is speaking to an interim search firm and saying, well, I can do anything for anyone. Sounds great, but actually, how is that search firm then going to place you? So you very much need to think about actually, what is that selling point? Is it your number of years as an HR director? Is it a specific sector? But behind that, sort of once you've worked out what that unique selling point is, there are definitely skills and behaviours that you need to support it. I think that the one I'll sort of pick on first is that focus on results. The likelihood is you'll be overqualified for the work that you're doing. That's what's made you successful. People are going to bring you in because they know you're going to hit the ground running and be able to get things done. And that is really, really important. As is credibility, because you need to get the respect of the people you're going to be working with, who will know the organisation far better than you do, who will be looking at you perhaps a little bit suspiciously. And you need to come in, and it's not about sort of the first 100 days as an interim, as it might be in another senior role. It's more like the first week, and actually what have you been seen to deliver in that week. So to be able to come in, build that rapport with the people around you, demonstrate that you really do know what you're doing, and start to show the value that you're bringing straight away is really, really important. And you could say that those things are equally important in a permanent role. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, nobody's going to be successful in their role if they're not focused on results or have that credibility. I think what really sort of separates interims from permanent employees is that detachment and independence. Won't necessarily be part of that inner circle. You're not going to be invited to the Christmas party, and that can definitely make you better at the work that you do. But it can be a bit of a strange place, particularly when you first start out. By knowing that actually there will be conversations that you're not part of. You're going to need to figure out who the key people are and how you can get the information that you need without necessarily being part of the team in the same way. Jess, I saw you nodding as I was talking about some of those things.
Really recognise all of those things, actually. We did a bit of research, nothing along the lines of what you've done, obviously, last year, just with some of our clients, talking to them about what they look for in an interim. And loyalty was a really big thing, actually. So somebody who's going to come in and actually finish the job. That's because in the last year or two, as the market's been a little bit quicker, We have seen some of our interim managers ditching one role for another that's either better paid or closer to home or just suits them a bit better. So loyalty was a really big one. And I think the ability to take feedback as well, you've got there about kind of being adaptable and things, but I think our clients found that if somebody comes in and has a certain approach, if they can feed back to that person and say, actually, this doesn't work in that environment, be a bit more this, and just to be open to that feedback and to be able to be adaptable was important. And just somebody who really solves a problem for them and doesn't create a problem. I think that's the worst thing for us. If we put an interim in who actually creates more problems than they are solving, that's the absolute worst service that we want to offer our clients. So I think those things came through really quite strongly, and somebody with values as well. That came across quite strongly as well.
I think that ability to take feedback one is really interesting, because as an employee in most, if not all organizations, you're going to have some sort of regular performance appraisal system. You're used to that kind of process of sitting down and being told how you're doing. And with some interim assignments, the only feedback you'll get is that they're paying your invoices and they ask you to stay on a bit longer. And actually that's great feedback because you know you're doing a good job. So I think it could probably be a little bit scary as an interim to suddenly get some feedback on this is how you're coming across. I think it's probably quite a long time since I've had that sort of conversation with someone. So you've got
well, it's quite regular for us now that we would have those kind of conversations, and actually the clients tend to come to us and then we have the conversations with the interim managers. But sometimes it's just a case of we get a call from a client saying their approach isn't working, we want rid of them straight away, or their approach isn't working, can you have this conversation with them? And we can often turn things around and just tinker the approach a little bit. But sometimes clients are not prepared to go down that road with an interim.
Jess, it might be worthwhile just for everybody's benefit, giving a little bit of background as to what markets Solace are working in, just to put some context behind that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so Solace is a provider almost solely to the public sector. And in the majority local government. So the majority of work that we do is within top teams, within local authorities or organisations either supplying or partnering with local government. So it would be directors, assistant directors, chief execs, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting terrain, I guess, to navigate. Just for the audience, in our previous webinars, we've had representatives from the interim service provider community that either work across all sectors or in a couple of cases specialize in private equity clients, which again, there are peculiarities around how you deal with these guys, or indeed in, normal ownership structures that are either corporate, commercial, family businesses, those kind of things. So I guess the ownership structure and the sector they're in will govern the kind of behavior of the client, and therefore the approach that you'll find when you get in there, and the nature of that contract or covenant between the provider and the supplier, which is you. Joe, I don't know if any of that came out of your research or if the sample was too small.
I think the sample was probably too small. If I think about the people I spoke to, including Tony, actually, just to give him a bit of a shout out, I think primarily private sector. I don't think there was anybody with a private equity background, and there definitely wasn't anyone with a public sector background. It's just the way it worked out with the sample that I had. So yeah, it wasn't something that specifically cropped up. Yeah.
Okay, moving on then.
So some of the downsides, and I think it's worth talking a little bit about these, because I think this is the reality. And the one that of all of these that I'd call out is the availability of assignments. Now, there is definitely a financial kind of practical element of that. If you cannot afford to be sat on the bench between assignments, then you really need to think about whether this is the right move. But it is about more than just the financial impact. It's that kind of psychological impact of it, because if you're going to spend your time between assignments worrying that the phone isn't going to ring again, that you've come to an end of an interim assignment and that's it, you're never going to get another one. To be honest, it's it might just not be the right environment for you. Now, it does get better over time. You build up more of a network, you'll build up relationships with interim search firms, and you realise that actually the phone does ring again and there are more assignments out there. But it's definitely something worth thinking about. You need a little bit of a financial buffer when you first start out, but also think about how you'll spend your time between assignments, because there will be time. And you also don't always have complete control over everything. So you might be being brought in just to deliver a part of something, or you might be delivering all of something. And that might mean that in the morning you're stuffing envelopes for redundancy meetings, and in the afternoon you're in a board meeting. I mean, you really do need to be adaptable and be prepared to roll your sleeves up and do what the client needs. And in a lot of assignments, you'll also need to actually think about, well, what is it the client needs, because they're not really sure. So after identifying it, you need to be able to then work with it. And I think it's hard work. It's really, really rewarding. It's a different sort of rewarding to a permanent role. But you are there every single day to prove your value. Your costs of the organisation in a lot of ways are far more visible than the cost of an employee. So you need to be prepared to sort of put the work in and make sure that they see that value from the start. And something that actually isn't on this slide, and it didn't specifically come out of my research, but I think it's something that certainly we've talked about on these webinars before, is that initial transition from a permanent career to an interim career. I think don't underestimate the difference that's going to make in terms of how you view your work. And Jess, I suspect that you probably have those conversations with people quite regularly as they're embarking on an interim career.
Yeah, we do. The virtual coffee mornings I mentioned earlier, actually, we run one set for existing associates and then another set for people who are new to the world and just want to have an open conversation and a dialogue with other people and network with people and learn about just exactly as we are doing here, really. And we do that on a 6 weekly basis. And there's usually a lot of people wanting to join that. So I think it is a really useful thing to be able to actually get into a forum like this and ask the questions and talk openly and just make sure that you are going down a path that is the right path for you, because you're absolutely right. You do need to be the right kind of person, the right kind of character. I think you've got to be resilient, like you say. You've got to be able to take the rough with the smooth, both within assignment and in between. You know, we've got some really great associates that we've had on our books for 10, 15 years. And we know when they're starting to get worried in between assignments, because they'll have painted the fence, they'll have mended the kitchen cupboard doors, they'll have dug the big hole in the garden, and then they'll start to ring and they'll be saying, I'm getting a bit bored now. I'd like to get on with something. So you can tell when people are starting to get a bit worried, but you do need to have that resilience. And like you say, you need to have that kind of, you need to have the financial backing as well to be able to take you through those gaps, I think. I think one of the most difficult things for us at the moment is managing to get an interim back out of the assignment. That's quite a difficult thing for us, because they will go in there, they'll do a good job. They're probably operating at a level beyond anybody who would apply for that job naturally. So to actually get that client to say, okay, the 6 months are done, you can go, that's the most difficult part for us, which is not necessarily a downside for our interim managers, but they do go into it for variety. So if they get stuck somewhere for 18 months, 2 years, then that's a bit of a downside for them.
Yeah. And Jess, can I just ask you a question? I mean, because I'm guessing that our participants cover a fairly wide range of disciplines, but within your sector, what are the specialisms and the skill sets that are hot at the moment? Finance, HR, procurement?
Yeah, so we cover everything in a local authority, which is absolutely everything. So all the corporate services, children's and adult services, regen, housing, everything that a local authority would do. I think the really in demand roles for us at the moment are the finance and the legal roles, because there are statutory roles in local government that have to be filled. So a section 151 and a monitoring officer in every local authority has to be filled. HR has been really busy for us actually over the last year. There's been lots of change, lots of OD projects and change projects. And I think the other one probably is housing. So there's been lots of changes in regulation in housing, lots of high profile housing issues on the news, and that's led to a big increase in demand for housing directors and heads of housing, that kind of thing.
Thanks. Okay.
So the last slide really is just about how do you sustain an interim career. So you've left your permanent career behind, you've got your first interim role, and sort of then what happens? The professional skills one is a really interesting one, because once you're an interim, no one's going to pay for your training except you. You're not going to go into an organisation and have them put you on a training programme for something. So I'm not saying that everyone needs to be as insane as I was and go off and do a master's, but you do need to think about what sort of training are you going to do to keep your professional skills up to date. Now, of course, you'll develop within your roles. Interim search firms are a really good source of training and content, and depending on what industry or what profession you're in, you may have CPD requirements as well, that you need to keep on top of. But it's just that reminder really that that's on you to do that. Networking is hugely important, and that doesn't necessarily mean wandering into a room full of people you don't know and striking up a conversation, but think about what networking means for you. How do you keep up with previous colleagues? How can you make use of the events run by interim search firms, for example? And one of the things that my research showed was, for successful interims, it's about having a really broad network, but those ties within that network can be quite loose. You don't have to be on top of these people all of the time, but you just need to be able to make sure that you do have as broad a group of people as possible that you can draw on, and that you're able to articulate your track record to them. So actually, it's more than just a nice chat. It's reminding them what you do, what your availability is, the sorts of things you'd love to do next. And in 13 years of being an interim, I've actually only been placed by a search firm once. Every other piece of work I've done has been through my network. It is hugely, hugely important to focus on that. And then my last point is just mindset. And it was a question that I asked all of the people that I interviewed, was do you think an interim is born or can be made? And the feedback came back, you can kind of learn some of the skills. And if you think about the behaviours we talked through, that a successful interim has, those are all things that you can refine over the course of your career. But ultimately, there did seem to be a bit of a feeling among these interims, it's kind of who you are. You are that person who seeks out the variety and the challenge, who might get potentially a little bit bored in one organisation for a long period of time. So I think that mindset piece is really important too.
Thank you, Joe and Jess, for that fascinating canter through your research. We've got a couple of questions coming in. So, Andrew, do you find that, like many roles now, interims are working remotely? So, Jess, what's your view on what's the market saying about remote working?
Ours have settled into a hybrid pattern, the vast majority of them. So the majority of consultancy work that we've done is done remotely now. But anything that's interim, the majority of them are hybrid. So it's very, very rare that we would get a client saying you can do it 100% remote. Some will say you need to just be on site for key meetings, but the majority will want at least 1 to 2 days a week on site. Which is better than, for our interims, it's better than it was, because generally they were on site, 5 days a week and staying away from home 4 nights a week. So it's a much better work-life balance, I think, for interims now. But definitely they're wanting at least a couple of days a week, I would say, on site.
I think, Andrew, my tuppence worth on this one is that the tectonic plates shifted when the pandemic hit. And so, we were all in the office, and then we were all out of the office, and then, it was a bit of the hokey cokey. We're kind of, depending on what the work is, you do it in the best way to get the job done. And some of the clients are not going into the office; they're working remotely. Some of the jobs we do are potentially, overseas. So, how does that work? So it all depends, I think. Tony or Simon, do you have a view on that? What are you guys seeing?
From my perspective, I think it's all about what the need of the client is and how that mandate needs to be delivered. So because our business supports across a variety of sectors and functions, we're kind of seeing a bit of a cross spectrum. I mean, a recent client situation, they're based out in Netherlands and they're delivering in London, but they're visible to London, you know, once or twice, maybe a fortnight for a couple of days. I think in your own case, Bruce, I seem to recall you're on an assignment that was in Finland or somewhere. So, you know, so I think the dynamic of remote versus virtual, I think there's I think for me, I've found within private equity in particularly if it's around finance and there's a change agenda and there's a lot of triage, they generally seem to want the comfort of visibility. But I think when it's more, I don't want to say BAU because I don't want to sort of imply that it's a softened role, but I think that is much more amenable to remote or hybrid.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony. We've got a question from Christopher Leonard. In marketing services, should they be marketed through a company brand or an individual? What he's saying is, I mean, when trying to sell one's own services. Now, you know, given the position of the IIM representing individuals working on their own account, would you like to expand on that? Because I think it plays into Joe's point about mindset as well, because effectively as career interims, we see ourselves running our own businesses.
Indeed, I think that's right, Bruce. So to reinforce the point, you almost certainly, if you haven't already, you will set yourself up with your own legal entity, be it a limited company or a partnership of some description. And you have to think about what you're doing as being the entire business. So you have to play all those individual roles. So you've got to market yourself, position, brand, the whole works. And you are the service offering. So it's an intimate combination of the two things. But when you're with the client, you also need to remember that although you are the primary giver of that service contractually, it's quite likely that you will need to indicate and have the client understand properly and agree that if for some reason you're not able to do it, like you're ill or that kind of thing for a short period or a longish period to make it relevant, you have the right to substitute somebody of equivalent standing and capability into that role. So there are a number of things which we already had IR35 referred to earlier, and without disappearing down that particular rabbit hole too far, you need to be able to demonstrate this being in business on your own account. And part of that is that you determine how the work is done, not the client. So the amount of supervision, direction or control that is exerted upon you should be an absolute minimum. The client is engaging you as a supplier, not as an employee.
Thanks, Tony. So look, before we move on to the second part, just updating on the results of the poll. So in terms of the people that filled that in, there was about 82% of the attendees filled the poll in. Roughly 1/3, 2/3. So 2/3 are currently not operating as interims. So interim curious people, 1/3 are. And out of the third that are, one person, 5% of that sample are on assignment, and 95% are seeking assignment. So what you've got to say coming up will be of, I guess, great interest to those guys that are looking for their first assignment or another assignment. 58 are in perm work, 42% aren't. And Tony, 90% have heard about the IIM, so it makes your job in a minute a wee bit easier. But interestingly, Jess, 80% have not sourced an assignment through an interim service provider. So a bit like what Joe was saying, getting work through their own network. So that's interesting as well. If you haven't work through an interim service provider, we do run webinars talking about the best way to engage with the interim service provider community. So with that happening, we've got a couple of other questions. Office politics. How much can office politics be an impediment to success in a role? How do you manage office politics? Well, my advice: steer clear. You know, you're not there to be their friend, and you do it for money. But of course, politics of one nature or another do actually come up. So how do you deal with that, and how do you advise your practitioners to deal with office politics, Jess?
I think it can have a really big effect, actually. Although you are supposed to go in there and be a little bit more independent from the politics of the organisation, if you go into an organisation which has a very, very strong culture in whatever kind of way, you've got to be very, very adept at dancing around that culture to be able to get done what you need to get done within that culture. And we've just had one example of one of our interim managers who went into a very specific culture in a team in a local authority, and his contract was ended early because the team decided they didn't like him, and they manoeuvred their way and got trade unions involved, and they manoeuvred the situation so that they had no choice but to remove this interim because that was the easiest thing to do. So there are office politics in every single office that you go in. There's no point you going in as an interim thinking I will be able to keep out of it, because sometimes you actually won't. So you do need to be able to go in, dive in and learn how to dance around it. Don't get involved in it, but you do need to become very adept at being able to get around it to get done what you need to get done.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and that's a perennial kind of topic, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about that. I mean, I can go into my own experience on that kind of stuff, but I won't. One about the market that we'll come on to, and one from Sean that we'll come on to. So look, let's move on to Simon. Simon, the quick intro from you, and then we'll get into the subject matter of what you're going to talk about.
Okay, so the quick intro is, it's there on the slide. Thank you, Bruce. So if anybody wants to find out more about Morphosis Partners specifically, then find me on LinkedIn or through the IIM. But essentially, one of our key areas of focus is to support the welfare and fortune and sustainability of the interim professional. This first slide here is really just about, I suppose, setting the tone for what life as an interim really is about, which I suppose reinforces the sentiments and the research from Jo and her own experience as an interim for 13 years. And often you've got to think about this reality check, which is, you know, being an employee surrounded by people who see the quality of the work that you do. The gateposts change, or the gateposts change, because now you're essentially going out there alone, essentially. And there's often the kind of phrase used with interims about it can be quite a nomadic lifestyle. But the reality is that you've got to bring the right resources or ecosystem around you. And, you know, the first thing to sort of realise is that, to Jess's point, that you can enter the interim profession at a variety of levels, but you can't enter the interim profession in a way of trying to reinvent your technical expertise that you've acquired to date and use that as the vehicle to reinvent. Reinvention is part of the journey rather than something that you would enact moving into interim. I think the other key point to go with that, therefore, is that you've got to be, again, to reinforce Jo's point, very clear on what your niche is. And it doesn't mean that you are, for example, an interim finance director. It's what is your niche within that? Because if you were to do a search, for example, on interim finance director, whilst potentially misguided, there's an awful lot of people that will come up on that search, whether they are true interims or not. So what you've got to be aware of is, within the function of, say, finance or marketing or whatever your expertise is, what are the situations and environments where you know you can back yourself, and more importantly, a potential client will back you to be the person to provide the solution for them. And then I think the other thing as well, which again touches upon, I think it was something that Tony said about setting up as a business, which is delivery upon assignment clearly is key to your onward reputation and sustainability, but it's only part of it. You know, there is the reality, which is you may have to set yourself up as a limited company. You may want to carry a website to support your case studies. You've got to network, you've got to market. And this isn't to put you off success as an interim. These are just prevailing realities of what the people that enjoy a sustainable career as an interim professional generally tend to do. So next slide then, please, Bruce. If you were to wrap up the basic formula, and certainly the formula that underpins the journey that the individuals at Morphosis Partners support, we effectively wrap it as three things. So if you were permanent and now you're positioning as interim, you can't turn around and say, I'm an established interim with 10 years of interim success. So you actually have to start with the idea of perception, which is, you know, setting your stall out as you now wish to be seen, and you know, making use of the expertise that you've acquired to help with that positioning. And that breaks down into your written message and your shop windows. It doesn't mean that you've got to become an influencer or you've got to fall in love with Instagram and all of that kind of nonsense. But it is about making sure that you can be found for what it is that you wish to be found for. And many people get that wrong. They often get very busy, and ultimately those things don't necessarily actually support their ability to win the next assignment. The comfort piece is all about how you interact with your audience, and with that, who is the audience? So if you're very good, for example, at marketing, and you're very good at digital transformation, and you happen to have delivered that, let's say, within retail or hospitality, then actually that should be the primary focus of how you define and shape your networking activities. And equally, when people come to your profile and reference points, that almost like the audit trail of that supports that. And then the reality check is just making sure that when it comes to things like your references and your day rate expectations, that they are in keeping with the expectation of the market, which does alter to sector and situation. So next slide then, please, Bruce. There are, and this is the good thing here, there are a number of routes to securing assignments. And for those who are new to interim, probably the cheat sheet for those who are just looking to start out as an interim is actually to go back to your former employers, because often they will sit there and go, we let you go, we're missing a bit of what you're good at. We're missing a bit of some of that capability. And often going back to those recent former employers can be quite a useful starting point, particularly as you set your stall out and become established with what your proposition is. You may not command the best day rates from them, but it could certainly be quite a useful way of getting the collateral together, the proof of concept, the proof of delivery, that can make you much more appealing to the ISP community. For those new to interim, ISP is interim service provider, such as the likes of Solace and others, of which there are many. And if you want to get a handle on the ISPs, then you may want to go to the IIM website, who basically spend a lot of time putting together an annual survey of the top ISPs, and that will help you to understand what their specialties are and who you should be looking to approach. So ISPs are definitely a home to look at. Existing network, absolutely. It may surprise the audience to know that for the people that we support, nearly 30% of our client results come from the networks that those individuals already have. It's just that we help them to interpret that network in a much better way for that forward success. And the two things that I think are really useful to point out when it comes to trying to shape your business development position to market, and even the way that you look to understand how ISPs work, is to consider two things. One is the competitor marketplace. So it won't be a surprise that if somebody's been working within Tesco, for example, for a number of years, that other major retailers, the likes of your Aldi's, your Lidl's, are likely to be receptive to you. So that's what we mean by competitor marketplace. The situational alignment, what we mean by that, and what you may want to think about is when you look at your permanent career, or if you look at your early career as an interim, you can start to see a pattern of what was that business situation? What was happening within that business that ultimately led to my being relevant? And for some people, the topical situation could be they always seem to be in turnaround, or they always seem to be integrating post-acquisition, or they're just about to do a carve out and a divestment. And you can start to see those kind of patterns. And when you do that, what you realize is that your brand positioning could be now, well, I'm an interim finance person, but actually my sweet spot is carve out or turnaround. And I'm really good actually at things like FP&A and doing the market analysis, etc., etc. That refinement to your proposition will make you very, very compelling to market. Next slide, please. And why is this relevant? Why is this useful? I don't want to sort of say it's logical, but it sort of is. And your demand is directly proportionate to the clarity that you convey to an audience and their need. And often we see people that have opportunities for networking and discussions, but they just don't quite align. They don't quite pick up on the right sentiments or issues. And then they go away from that meeting with effectively a coffee receipt instead of an opportunity to deliver assignment. And I'm using that kind of phrase because that's something my business partner, Joe Rawcliffe, talks about a lot. You know, networking is pointless if all you come away with is a bunch of coffee receipts for your accountant once a quarter. So, you know, but it is about being visible, but it's about the effectiveness and the efficiency of how you spend your time. And certainly what doesn't work is knocking on doors and say, gives a job. It really isn't going to win you any favors. And the other sentiment that seems to be going around the market that doesn't work either is the idea of accepting that you've just got to kiss a lot of frogs. Really, if that was your strategy in a business, the business wouldn't be doing very well for long. There has to be that persona of precision. Why? Because to me, the persona of an interim professional is really the comfort through that credibility. And it's that leadership persona that you offer. And so really, the clearer you are about that fit, the better you're able to seek out. Ultimately, the time between assignments, which everybody is clearly going to need, but at least you have a greater sense of control on that time between assignments. And I think the true masters of interim success are the ones who are very deliberate, as best as they can be, in having that time off, which everybody will need. So utilization isn't about making it 100% all of the time, but it is about making sure that you are in a stronger position to make better choices from the available assignments. And ultimately, that the journey that you have as an interim professional works for you as intended. And that's ultimately got to be your primary driver. And I think that's it, isn't it, Bruce?
Words of
Thank you very
wisdom,
much.
Simon. Yeah, that's fantastic. I have to say, I learn something every time I hear you talk. So thank you very much for that. So look, moving swiftly on, Tony, while questions are coming in, would you like to give us the background to the IIM, what the IIM does, and why it's a good idea for the people on this call to consider membership, either at the associate or the full member level?
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Bruce. So shall we just click on? There we go. So I don't propose to read the slide out, but this gives you the brief background of the Institute. We were formed in 2001. All our members are accredited, so you apply for membership to the Institute, and your application, which is essentially your CV and some referees that we will contact to establish your bona fides, as it were. If all that stacks up and you're an active interim, then it's likely that you would be offered the opportunity to join as a member of the Institute. If you're new to the profession and you don't have any interim work or only maybe the odd assignment so far, that's fine, because a lot of our membership is at the associate level. So people will join as an associate to demonstrate that they've made the commitment to the profession. And after a year or two of doing active work, you can come back and ask for that work to be referenced, and you can then apply for an upgrade to full member status. We operate, and every member on accepting the offer of joining signs up to a code of conduct, which we take seriously. You can find it on our website if you wish to read it through. It's basically requiring people to behave ethically and with very good corporate governance in the way that they go about their work. We also have people who are organisations which are affiliates or partners. So, for example, Jess is representing Solace today. They're an affiliate of the Institute. And this means that they're comfortable as an organisation signing up and aligning their interests with that of the IIM in the way that we're here to develop and promote the profession as a whole and the marketplace with it. So, Bruce, if you just roll on, thank you. We are in fact an organisation which is limited by guarantee, so our members are our owners, and we are for interims and run by interims. So everybody on the board is actually a volunteer. We do this as well as the day job of being an interim, which we value and operate in that way so that people who are administering the organisation are clear about the requirements, if you like, and maintain that direct link with acting as professionals. You can see here that on the left, we've got a list of things that we do offer in terms of facilities for people who wish to join. The WhatsApp group is quite active. You'll find on there people using it as a vehicle for sharing with other people particular problems or issues, or have you got a such and such a thing that might help. I think there was a question in the Q&A, Bruce, which was talking about how do you assess a day rate.
Yeah,
that's a reasonable question to ask your colleagues what their experience has been as an example. We do a whole raft of things here in different ways and shapes and forms, and we also do quite a bit of lobbying, which is really when we get potential changes to various forms of regulation government is proposing, and we respond to those kinds of consultation periods for the relevant regulation. On the right, you can see a list of things that we do have experience of, either as an institute or through our membership, where we've helped various members over a period of time. Depends upon your need. Clearly, the need when you're first starting out in the profession is a little bit different. A lot of it's all about prep and setup and that kind of thing. As you become more experienced, then the need is often network expansion activity and things like that, or where there are changes in regulation, understanding what that might mean, and so on. We also have quite strong working relationships with quite a number of ISPs, and we always welcome people becoming organisations becoming affiliates, because that gives us the opportunity to continue to find ways and means of collaborating. And a good example of that is, of course, Jess today giving some of her time for this webinar. And I should say thank you both to Jess and to Joe and to Simon for doing that. Simon, through Morphosis, does some work with us where we actively encourage membership to take advantage of the service or parts of the service, because there's a whole menu-driven set of options that they do. To try and help in terms of your commercializing you as a brand, I think is how I would put it, and I'm sure Simon would put it far better than me, but it's there, and the facility gives you through the Institute, being a member of the Institute gives you a cost-effective route into that.
Just on that one, Tony, when is your next taster session, Simon? Do you have that to hand where you're running the hour of going through
Yeah,
what you
so
offer?
that's in 2 weeks' time, and I think that's already been positioned on the
Yeah.
IIM website.
Yeah.
On the website, yeah. So if you go to the website, then you can see details of when Simon will go through the what he does and who that's for and how you get involved. And I would encourage everybody to come and have a look at that, because again, fascinating stuff. Tony, back to you.
If we move on one slide, then becoming a member does not cost a fortune. We are the only professional body in the UK exclusively dedicated to the promotion of the individual interim practitioner. We are here for all forms of interim. So we don't mind what your technical expertise is. We're very happy to have you apply for membership. I mentioned the lobbying that we do earlier. We also go through education activity where we try and put webinars or face-to-face events on where we will cover particular topics which we are seeing as relevant to keeping your professional expertise up as an interim, as opposed to if you're a finance person. We don't give you finance training. Your professional institute will give you that, but we do help you develop your interim standing, and showcasing there's the opportunity through what we do to be able to demonstrate your skill set, if you like, through us as a shop window. So all I can do is encourage you all, please, to seriously consider applying for membership, assuming that you have, as a result of this, been lulled into a false sense of security and decided the interim profession is for you. On a slightly more serious note, it's certainly worthy of everybody's consideration, but to reinforce Joe's point, you need to be of a particular approach and mentality to the way that you do things, comfortable in your own skin, comfortable being taking independent standpoints and points of view, and really love the opportunity to be involved in change. Just as a factoid, last few years, the annual survey the Institute does, 90% of all assignments being recorded through the survey are all involved in some way, shape or form in significant change with the client.
Thanks, Tony. So, Christopher, just to your point, if you go onto the IIM website, you'll see the survey, and benchmark day rates are published there for various types of work, various disciplines, etc., and so on. So, yes, there is a way of doing that.
Can I just add a couple of things? There are two ways of looking at the day rate that you go for. One is, please, before you go out and start looking at what the market might offer, decide what your minimum acceptable day rate is.
Yeah.
Before you've decided whether you're going to become an interim or not. It's part of that process. Make the assumption that you're only going to work for 6 months of the year. And also think about what's the minimum amount of money you need to be able to maintain your lifestyle and your existing financial commitments.
It's not just maintaining the lifestyle, but all those things that you were able to take for granted as an employee, like private health cover, illness insurance, and that sort of thing. Cost those out too.
And not least, how you pay HMRC. Which
don't even start me on that one.
which after 30 years I still haven't figured out, by the way.
Oh, well, they keep changing, which is most unreasonable of them. Okay, so it's really understand what your base level is, and then you can go and have a look at the bits of the market you think you want set up to address, and start to then explore whether or not that day rate, do it on a basic day rate, and whatever minimum amount of money per day, can it stand the area you're going into? Can it stand that kind of day rate? have you got some headroom in the sense that you might want, let's say you might need 700 a day for 6 months to ensure you've got enough to keep you going over 12 months, then looking at what you can find out, going and cross-checking with various people, networking for maybe it's 800 or 900 a day, for example, that is a typical day rate in that particular sector, in which case you've room to grow. So it really is taking it one step at a time and feeling your way in.
Okay,
Sorry,
well,
Bruce.
thanks, Tony. So I hope that answers your question, Christopher. I mean, as you can probably tell, there's probably a lot more to that, which again we cover on various sessions, on webinars, on the WhatsApp group, on the website. So without further ado, I'd like to thank the panelists personally, thank all the attendees. I know some have started to drift off. Those that have stayed to the end, thanks. You'll be able to pick up the recording and the slides on the website, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon as you embark on your, continue on your interim career. So with that, I'd like to close and wish you all a great day in what promises to be the hottest day of the year, certainly down our way. So see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you very
everyone.
much, people.
Bye.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you.